Well, again, good morning, everyone. My name is Christy Demitz. I am a health educator with Michigan State University Extension and a member of the North Central Region Aging Network. And we're so glad that you have all taken the time to join us today. Uh, just to get a sense of where people are coming from, if you can type in the chat just what state you are in, that would be great. And we will then that we'll know where people are attending. Also, if you are not or your state does not have a member on the North Central Region Aging Network, or if you want more information about NCRAN, please put your email address in the chat box, and we will get back with you and get you more information. Also, as we go through here today, the Q&A is um, available to you, and Tanner will do the best he can to get to all of the questions. But if we run out of time, he will follow up with you. Also, we do have an end of webinar survey that we would really love for you to complete. It helps the North Central Region Aging Network show who they're reaching and that there is interest in providing these webinars on a monthly basis. In July, we will not have a webinar. We take that month off, but we will be back in August, and they're always the first Friday of the month. So again, thank you, everyone. And I want to introduce Tanner Durr from Michigan State University Extension. He is a health educator, and he will be presenting on making mindful connections to heal loneliness today. And Tanner is going to give a little bit more about himself and then go into the presentation. So welcome, Tanner.
Thanks, Christy. Yep, and I do want to mention too, so the way the chat's set up in the Zoom, we can see your chats, but you might not be able to see each other's chats in the Zoom. So just be rest assured they are there. We can see them, and I'll be checking them periodically as we go throughout as well. Um, so I just wanted to start this presentation with kind of a more in-depth introduction, maybe in a slightly different way than I normally would introduce myself. But just kind of by asking that question, who am I? So my name is Tanner Durr. I have a master's degree in public health from the University of Michigan. And I switched sides and I joined Michigan State University Extension, where I've been for 3.5 years now. I work as a health educator. I'm an older brother. I'm a son, a grandson, nephew, cousin, and friend. I live in Saginaw, Michigan, with my two cats, Murray and Lenny. Um, and just kind of going through and answering these questions helped me realize and kind of reorient myself because we each play a lot of different roles in our lives and in our environments, in our communities, in our families, in our social networks. And we have these unique aspects of our identity that help shape our own view of who we are as people and how we fit in with others in our community, in our environment, and in our relationships as well. So it's just a question to kind of keep in mind as we go throughout this presentation as well. And since I mentioned Murray and Lenny, I figured I would show them as well. They might pop in here and there throughout the webinar. You might be able to hear Lenny in the background. So I got Murray as a kitten to kind of help me with some of my loneliness. And then Lenny showed up on the sidewalk behind my apartment a few weeks later, and I brought him in, and Murray was like, "Sweet, I have a brother now." So they keep each other really great company, and they keep me company and entertained as well. And pets can be a really great way to also help address loneliness issues. So we don't want to forget our furry friends or feathered friends if you have maybe a bird. I was doing a webinar last week. Someone shared they have a 25-year-old parrot that like keeps them entertained. So today I kind of have these four objectives laid out for us. So the first one is to discuss what loneliness is, and we're going to go into actually some theories on loneliness before we look at some of the data, and talk about how it affects your well-being in kind of a general sense. We'll explore loneliness throughout the lifespan and how loneliness might present differently depending on where we are in our life. We're going to learn how mindfulness can help us connect and some of those other strategies to help us reconnect and address or heal loneliness. And I'm going to close by sharing some resources to build your own mindfulness practice. So my hope for today is you'll be able to take at least one takeaway, make one personal connection with the content or the resources for today. So in our field, we provide a lot of programs to older adults, especially through NCRAN, right? Um, Caregivers, care receivers. One of the main takeaways I always have after providing a program with these groups, whether it's at a senior center or assisted living facility, whether we're delivering powerful tools for caregivers, PATH or a chronic disease management program, or a more general mental health promotion program like mindfulness or sleep, is we typically have these participants sharing afterwards. They didn't realize other people were struggling with the same things. They felt alone. So I think it's really important that we just recognize that we really aren't alone. We often feel alone in a lot of different things, but we're more connected than we think. So that's going to bring us into our first question for today. And I do want this to be a question, so if you'd be willing to put this in the chat, um, it's what comes to mind when you think of loneliness or when you hear loneliness? Maybe they're words. Some people have verses that they bring up, feelings, songs, art, movies, poems, books, even like colors. Like, are there colors that come to mind? Someone shared isolation. That's definitely a word that gets brought up with loneliness. There's a lot of really interesting concepts around loneliness that we can get really specific on. What are we feeling? What are we experiencing? Is it isolation? Is it loneliness? Is it disconnection? Someone shared feeling sad. So there's some mood elements, perhaps. The color gray. Sometimes people say the color blue. It might be like less saturation. Um, so there's a lot of these really interesting aspects of loneliness, I think, that come to mind that we've been either socialized to kind of understand as being lonely, or we just intuitively kind of ascribe that meaning to as this feels kind of lonely or isolated or disconnected. So just thinking about that, even like what are the social messages we get around loneliness? Someone might even say solitude. Solitude can be a good thing. Sometimes it's good to have some alone time, right? Sometimes we need a break from other people, and that can be really restorative and healthy for us. Um, so it's just a question to keep in mind is as we go throughout, like what do we think of loneliness when we hear that word? This first definition I want to give to you comes from John McGraw back in 1995. He wrote this paper called Loneliness, Its Nature and Forms, an Existential Perspective. And I'll be very forthright with you. I'm very much an existentialist. I like to think of things from that perspective. So just getting my bias out in the open here. But he provided these kind of three aspects or almost definitions of loneliness. We know loneliness has been defined in many ways from multiple disciplines and perspectives. We'll get into some more contemporary kind of concepts or conceptualizations of loneliness as well. But this definition from John McGraw states that loneliness refers to desired but unattained personal or personified relationships for which one yearns. So there's a relationship we want, but we don't really have it, whether it's a specific person or just a kind of yearning for maybe like a close friend or other. A second kind of loneliness might be the absence of current relationships which one misses. So I moved to Saginaw. I'm about an hour and a half away from my friends. Or I have friends that moved to Chicago, like after grad school. It's like I still have a relationship with them, but I kind of miss being able to spend, more time with them. Or three, the loss of past relationships, which one mourns or grieves. Um, so kind of this idea of loneliness or this type of loss that might be involved in loneliness. And these concepts will come up later as we kind of look at the lifespan perspective of loneliness as well. So loneliness, um, kind of summarizing this slide up, it might be wishing for a relationship, missing a relationship, or maybe even mourning the loss of a relationship, um, is one way to kind of think about at least three kinds of loneliness. And these are all kind of related to relationships with other people. And later we'll get into more of even like relationships with ourselves or the environment. So I'm going to take a drink of water real quick. So McGraw shared in this paper Um, Though loneliness is a perennial, indeed immemorial human nemesis, it was the first thing that the biblical God named not good. It is thought to have reached epidemic proportions in modern times. So how many of you have heard of, the loneliness epidemic or the loneliness crisis? Um, it's a little bit of a rhetorical question, but hopefully you've heard of it or it's become more popular recently. And I just want to point out this isn't 1995. This is 30 years ago at this point. When he talks about modern times and epidemic proportions, and we'll look at some more modern trends coming up too. So in that paper, he also he goes into like there's probably all these different types of loneliness, and he lists these 8 types of loneliness. And I'm not going to go into all the specifics on them, but I want to list them here because this isn't even necessarily an exhaustive list. So he even talks about metaphysical loneliness, epistemological loneliness, communicative loneliness, ontological loneliness, ethical loneliness, existential loneliness, emotional loneliness, which starts to get into more of that personal loneliness. Like, do I feel connected to my feelings and maybe even my thoughts and my values and myself, my purpose in life? Social loneliness with other people, cultural loneliness, and cosmic loneliness. And I like to bring up cultural loneliness. We won't get into it a lot today, but I was able to deliver a presentation to a stakeholder group that worked with farmers. And I talked a lot about cultural loneliness. There's some interesting research out there demonstrating that ag workers might experience this kind of loneliness, where there's a disconnection between feeling like the public doesn't really understand or value the kind of work they're doing, which we might also see that in public health spaces, maybe in more recent years as well. So, getting beyond maybe definitions of loneliness or operationalizations of loneliness that we might find in research and types of loneliness, I wanted to try and provide at least a few different theoretical perspectives as to the purpose of loneliness. Like, so why does loneliness exist? We can talk about what loneliness is, but I think it's also interesting to explore maybe why loneliness exists or the purpose of it. So this is the evolutionary theory of loneliness from John Cacioppo, who I at least consider to be kind of like the godfather of a lot of this loneliness work. And this evolutionary theory of loneliness he developed to describe how loneliness may have evolved as an adaptive evolutionary mechanism to increase our chances of survival, right? By encouraging people to cooperate in groups. So early tribal groups, like way back when, it was really dangerous to be alone, right? We didn't have all these civilizations built up necessarily. So if you were alone, you were pretty vulnerable to the elements, to animals, to disease. We really needed to cooperate in those hunter-gatherer groups. So he said, well, maybe over time, our brains started to realize, well, if we're alone, we're in danger and we get really stressed out. Um, so a fun fact that maybe not a fun fact, but a fact that may have come out of this is this idea that, or this finding that when you feel lonely, you crave carbohydrates. So maybe chocolate or sugar or ice cream. Um, and his kind of interpretation of that is this is a dense source of calories that you could survive on for longer periods of time if you got separated from the group. So if I was separated from the group for maybe a couple of days, I got lost on a hunting trip, but I found some honey, like that's going to be really valuable for me because I don't know when I'm going to be able to get back to the group where we're sharing meals, and feel safe. So this is one perspective. It starts to get into maybe even some biological, like biomarkers. Um, Another perspective is the need to belong from Baumeister and Leary, also in 1995. Big year for loneliness research and belonging. Um, and in this seminal publication, um, they laid the foundation to argue for belonging as a fundamental need. So we have the evolutionary perspective, why some of the biological reasons why our brain developed in this way, and why loneliness is stressful. Um, and then we have this kind of needs-based perspective. So it's a slightly different take on it. They argued that human beings are fundamentally and pervasively motivated by a need to belong. In much the same way we have a need for food, water, and oxygen. So they said, well, how can we even test this theory? If it's a needs-based theory, then we can test it, right? This is scientific. So if someone has unmet belongingness, if their need to belong is not being met, there should be all these negative consequences that occur, right? So if someone feels like they don't belong, what we've found is their mental health is worse, physical health is worse, they have lower meaning in life. So there's a lot of these adverse effects that come out of this. So really, they kind of brought in this idea of belonging as a very real need that needs to be met. And this goes above and beyond attachment theory as well. Um, so I like to bring that up because I in an internship before my graduate studies, I started bringing up this work in the context of resilience and building resilience. So how do we build resilience from trauma, from adverse childhood experiences, even substance use? And I was like, oh, well, belonging seems like a really big aspect of this. And my I guess my preceptor at the time was like, oh, that's just attachment theory. I'm like, no, man, like in the paper, they even say this, like word for word. This goes above and beyond attachment theory. And I'd even say, so I do some work on opioid education and prevention. Um, and we hear from people in recovery all the time, the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. So I think that's a really, really powerful takeaway, and that's from people with lived experience. So Baumeister and Leary go on to say, if psychology has erred with regard to the need to belong, in our view, the error has not been to deny the existence of such a motive so much as to underappreciate it. So like this is real, guys. We gotta take this seriously. Like, and McGraw is saying it's reached epidemic proportions with loneliness, and they're kind of on opposite sides of the coin. One's belonging, which is positive, the other's loneliness, which is kind of bad for our health. So I don't know how much communication they had with each other. This is in 1995. They followed up with a real banger of a new theory here in 2000. They switched authorship. Yeah, I can say so. What we hear from people in recovery is the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. I believe that's the quote. I think I might be getting it hopefully correct. It's one I think is pretty searchable as well. Um, so we see at the turn of the century in 2000, Leary and Baumeister, Mark Leary's like, I want to get first authorship. Cool. They published this sociometer theory of self-esteem where they kind of go a step farther with their belonging theory, where they say, hey, let's look at the concept of self-esteem. That's a really important concept and construct in the field of psychology. Let's see what self-esteem kind of is. Like maybe that's related to belonging. So they said that high self-esteem is related to feeling like we could effectively belong to an attractive or a protective social group. So even blending that in with evolutionary theory, right? We want to be able to belong to those groups that we feel like are successful, are strong, are going to be able to protect us, that are valuable. And how does that relate to our own identity and our self, right? Our concept of self. Do we feel good about ourselves? Um, and it gets into a lot of other in-group, out-group things too. But it's a really interesting perspective to kind of consider. And this theme might show up later as well. So getting more into contemporary loneliness. So although these nuanced and detailed theories all exist from, 20, 30 years ago at this point, and there's been more work done in this space, and there's other theories out there as well. Um, Much of the contemporary discussion around loneliness kind of centers around these four types of loneliness, which include emotional loneliness or those sort of personal feelings of loneliness. So someone shared when we think of loneliness, they might think of like sad, like oh, it kind of makes me sad, or I think of maybe it might make someone feel sad. That might also include like possible disconnection from the self. So I might have a hard time identifying what are my emotions, or my thoughts, or my body might not even feel kind of like my own. We can get into social loneliness, which is what I think a lot of people think of when they think of loneliness, which is that lack of desired, meaningful relationships with other people, whether that's friends, family, romantic partners. Um, Cultural loneliness, so a lack of belonging to a broader culture or community, and then also spiritual loneliness, which gets into more of a lack of meaning in life and purpose. So, another way I kind of think about loneliness is I reorient things to be focused around disconnection. So you can think about emotional like disconnection, like I feel disconnected. I feel disconnected from myself, disconnected from others, disconnected from culture, or spiritual aspects of my identity. So the US Surgeon General came out with this loneliness advisory in 2023, kind of summarizing some of the research in the field, and said really focused in largely on social loneliness. And just the one pager policy brief takeaways, this is what they came up with, saying, summarizing the research we found, and we assert that humans are wired for social connection, kind of like evolutionary theory of loneliness. But we've become more isolated over time. So this problem's kind of become worse since, like thousands of years, maybe even. Social connection significantly improves the health and well-being of all individuals. We'll talk about how loneliness impacts our health. Social connection is vital to community health and success. So getting into maybe a more of a public healthy type perspective on this, like how do we look at social determinants of health and encouraging belonging and valuing belonging as like a fundamental need. And also they share together we can advance social connection and improve our nation's public health, which is an aspiration. Um, I'm gonna really breeze through these few slides pretty quickly. This is just one example of a paper that worked towards a neurology of loneliness, just showing that loneliness really does impact our body. So this one is just looking at brain structures and our nervous system. We know that it also impacts cardiovascular health, and all sorts of other aspects of our body through our stress response system. There's also research out there that shows if you show a graphic of a brain, people think it's smarter. So I like to include that as well. Um, but what we see here is some of the main areas affected by loneliness. I include the prefrontal cortex right here. I think mine finished developing, hopefully, or maybe not hopefully, right? Maybe hopefully, maybe I can stretch it out another couple of years, for higher level thought and reasoning. Our temporal parietal junction, which helps with theory of mind, so understanding that other people have different thoughts from me, and also social cognition, so understanding other people's behaviors. The striatum, which is important in our dopamine pathways and social interaction and rewards. Our amygdala, which is important for our limbic system, and our fight, flight, freeze response. Our hippocampus, which is really important for memory consolidation and emotional processing. And also our visual cortex, right at the back of our head, which is important for processing visual stimuli. Um, so, um, the evolutionary theory of loneliness, right, is like we're in danger if we're alone. We also know over time our brain has gotten really good at identifying danger in the environment generally, and it's even exaggerates that danger sometimes. So if we're in fight or flight, we're really looking out for danger, including social danger, in the environment. So some of these effects on biology. So with lonely brains, they found a higher tonic vascular resistance, which leads to higher blood pressure, higher hypothalamic pituitary adrenal activation, which is our toxic stress response or our chronic stress response, which we know wreaks havoc on our bodies and our brains. Lower inflammatory control, again, from the stress response. Lower immune system activation, so we might be getting sick more often, or we might even be presenting with chronic diseases earlier. And lower sleep salubrity, which is one of my favorite words I've learned. It essentially means like sleep efficiency and quality of sleep. And I've even Googled like salubrity, and I don't know if like, so this is from Cacioppo and I believe his wife, in 2014. I don't know if they came up with the word or they started using the word a lot to maybe differentiate some of their research, but it's a term I like to use. So they found some of the effects on brain activity include higher activation of the visual cortex and lower activation of the temporoparietal junction when shown images of unpleasant people. So our visual cortex kind of flares up if we see an unpleasant person and we're lonely, because if we're lonely and we see an unpleasant person, we know we already feel like we're in danger and we're vulnerable. So we're going to have kind of an exaggerated response to that. Increased activation of the ventral striatum to pleasant objects versus pleasant people, which is the opposite pattern of non-lonely people. and decrease activation of our prefrontal cortex when viewing negative social scenes. Um, and then last slide with the brain on here. So this is from animal models, but they found that in lonely brains, there was lower neurogenesis, low nerve growth factor in the hippocampus, found our prefrontal cortex gets messed up, lower cyclic AMP response in the Krebs cycle, larger primary visual cortex. If our brain is constantly looking out for danger, our brain will change through neuroplasticity. And it starts to become kind of a lonely brain that becomes evolved to look for danger and try to find ways to keep us safe, and low cell proliferation in the amygdala. So, with that being said, I just kind of summed up a lot of the more public health effects of loneliness and health. I wanted to ground some of the effects of loneliness in our biology first. I think that's a great way to connect with people sometimes because sometimes it's helpful to see the data and see the actual biomarkers. And that was just a snapshot of that. But I wanted to share this snapshot from Julianne Holt-Lundstad and colleagues, and she's done a lot of great work in this space and helped with the Surgeon General Advisory. Just had a couple of really um, popular, I can't think of the right word, prominent findings that have become very popular lately. The risk associated with social isolation and loneliness is comparable with well-established risk factors for mortality, including those identified by the DHHS, such as physical activity, obesity, substance abuse, responsible sex behavior, mental health, injury and violence, environmental quality, immunization, and access to healthcare. Um, so the famous finding, famous is the word I was trying to think of, was that loneliness has been shown or estimated to be at least as bad for your health as smoking up to 15 cigarettes per day. So that's a finding from her team, which I think is like a little over half a pack. I'm not sure. Someone can maybe correct me in the chat. Um, so with that, I want to move into maybe some trends we're seeing. So how is this affecting the population? So who is lonely, and maybe even how does that loneliness develop over time? Um, so this is another question, so I can take a drink of water. But which age group do you think is the loneliest? It doesn't have to be like a specific number, but do you think it's babies? Do you think it's kids? Do you think it's middle adulthood? Um, I see a lot of people saying older adults, and adults. Yeah. So that's the most common popular answer that a lot of people give for sure. Someone shared teens. Holly shared young adults and older adults. Um, so yeah, so what we see from some of the findings. So I'm going to share some results from an American Psychiatric poll from 2024, and then we actually just got some 2025 results in. So they found that, and I'll answer this question, but they found that 30% of adults say they experience loneliness at least once a week in the 2024 poll. 10% say they feel lonely every day. So 1 in 10 feel lonely every day. 30% aged 18 to 34, which they considered young adults, which I like because I fit in that group, so I'm still a young adult, reported feeling lonely every day or several times a week, which is twice as much as older age groups. Single adults were nearly twice as likely to report feeling lonely on a weekly basis, 39% versus 22%. And that was over the past year. So it was kind of a retrospective, thinking back on the past year. How did you feel? So they found that lonely younger adults, 18 to 34, were twice as much as older age groups. Now they don't get into the specifics of breaking down the older age groups between like early older adulthood, late adulthood, which I'll get into. They followed up this poll with the 2025 poll. They found it went up from 30 to 33%. I'm not sure if that's a statistically significant difference, but it is a difference, I guess, enough to mention. So 33% of adults say they experience loneliness at least once a week. For that age range again of 18 to 34, still more likely to report loneliness than older adults, are significantly more likely than other age groups to turn to social media when they're feeling lonely, as well. Um, so yeah, so I can share that statistic about loneliness being as bad as cigarette use. So that it came from a meta-analysis from Julianne Holt-Lundstad and colleagues. I don't remember if it was 2010 or 2012, which is probably not what you're asking. Um, but what they did is they estimated the actual impact of loneliness on mortality. So they try to look at like the power of it. And then they compared it with the effects of obesity, air pollution, a lot of other factors. And they found that it roughly estimated out to the risk of smoking 15 cigarettes per day. Um, so I think they also talk about that finding in the U.S. Surgeon General advisory as well. I'd be shocked if they didn't. I'm pretty sure they did, because she helped write that as well. Um, so so yeah, so that's where that finding came from. It's an estimation. They didn't do a. It would be really interesting if they did a real experimental study where they're like, all right, you're this group, you're going to smoke 15 cigarettes a day. You're this group, you're just going to be lonely. I've not explained this finding before in serious nature, but I was like, so if you smoked 14 cigarettes with a friend, that's maybe not what they're saying, but yeah, so it was more about like effect size. Um, so getting back to this trend though, so I'll talk a little bit more about social media and technology use in a couple of slides, referring back to the younger people. But what we've seen kind of repeatedly through different studies, and these studies there's consensus in the field that better work needs to be done just methodologically. It's really difficult work to do because we're talking about over the lifespan. So a lot of these studies are cross-sectional, taking, at one point in time, we're gonna ask younger adults and older adults. But what we found is that loneliness tends to follow this kind of bimodal distribution, or there's sort of two peaks. So throughout maybe childhood, so like elementary school up into teenage years, you're usually not super lonely. At least you're in school. Like there's certainly different factors that can go into loneliness there, and kids can absolutely be lonely. But it tends to peak around early young adulthood. So 18 to 29 years is usually when we get the biggest peaks. If we think about it, right, a lot of times it's teenagers that are turning into adults, by definition. A lot of times there's uncertainty. There's a level of independence that's new. Many people are perhaps moving out of the house, trying to establish career paths, get a job. Some people might choose to start a family, form their own sense of community. There's a lot of uncertainty. Even going back to that first um, kind of definition of loneliness, right? Like of uncertainty about types of relationships we long for, that we want, that we don't have. Then we get into middle adulthood. So 30 to 65 is what they kind of talk about maybe as middle adulthood, where most people maybe start to settle in. They might have some more stability. They might be in a specific area that they kind of maybe wanted to be in. They work towards that. They might have a career path or a stable job. They might be forming their family. They might have a more stable friend group at this time, and things kind of start to settle down. And then we see it start to pick back up again, and by it I mean loneliness, in late adulthood. So like 80 plus, which is where we start to see, loss. So loss of independence and functioning, loss of loved ones, even loss of income can be a really big factor here as well. So that impacts the way we see ourselves, we think about ourselves, and our relationships with other people. So what we see is, in summary, youngest people tend to be the loneliest. But then it starts to pick back up in older adulthood. And these types of loneliness might even be a little bit different. Like they might be experienced differently for different reasons. Um, so yeah, so I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna answer this comment from Michelle who shared. Sorry, I shouldn't have said your name, Michelle. But there's this idea out there that people can be surrounded by other people yet still feel lonely. So I should have shared this in the definition of loneliness. But what we know about loneliness is that loneliness, everyone agrees on this consensus, is subjective. So if you feel lonely, you are lonely. It's up to you to kind of define that feeling. So if I feel lonely, then I am lonely. Then I experience all of these things, all of those things with the brain charts. Um, and we feel it throughout the rest of our body. So there is a difference between social isolation or even physical isolation. So maybe you live in like remote the UP or the peninsula in Michigan or Alaska or somewhere that's not densely populated, and you could still feel connected to others and not be lonely. Or maybe you live in like Metro Detroit and you're surrounded by people and you're in an apartment building, um, but you don't feel connected to them. You can still feel lonely. So there's this internal evaluation that happens with our surroundings with other people that kind of determines that. Um, so, other things I want to address is that loneliness is not distributed or experienced equally. So, loneliness kind of is an inequitable public health crisis. So, I'm going to briefly touch on over the next three slides. The KFF Health News, they ran a survey of racism, discrimination, and health, and they found while at least 1 in 5 young adults say they are always or often lonely, the shares are higher among young Black adults and young white adults than they are among young Hispanic or Asian adults. And those are general trends, right? And that's just measuring loneliness on likely a short scale. We know that it's also impacted by socioeconomic status. So, additionally, adults living in lower income households, less than $40,000 annually, are about 3 times as likely to report frequent loneliness as those who live in higher income households of $90,000 or more. So, income plays a role as well. And then we know that gender and sexuality also play a role. And I especially want to note this in June during Pride Month. So overall, women were more likely than men to say they have felt always or often lonely in the past year. And these are self-reports on surveys. I've seen some things out there about like older men feeling really lonely. And there's some really interesting narrative studies as to why that might be the case as well. Um, but this is what this survey found. And across racial and ethnic groups, LGBT adults are about twice as likely as non-LGBT adults to say they felt always or often lonely in the past year. Um, so this was one survey, but I think it also brings up this other concept of social capital. So do I feel like I have the resources? Do I feel like I have the safety involved in my community and my environments where I can go out and be my authentic self and make connections with other people and access resources? Which brings us into some of the solutions proposed by the Loneliness Advisory. So they came up with these 6 pillars of social connection. So they talked about we need to strengthen social infrastructure, enact pro-connection public policies, mobilize the health sector, reform digital environments, deepen our knowledge, and cultivate a culture of connection. Um, I just wanted to pause and take that all in, right? It all sounds really great, and it is great. Like these are all great ideas. Some of them would be really great, and we need to keep some of these larger perspectives in mind if we're going to be addressing some of those inequities in social capital and distribution. Um, but a lot of these are like higher level functioning where we're going to have to impact systems. So I'm going to get into some more specific steps that we might be able to take to impact maybe some loneliness on a more personal level. But before I do that, I'm going to take a special note here on reforming digital environments and just some current events and topics going on in June 6th, 2025. So these are some recent stories that have been published in terms of digital environments. So I just want to have just a note on artificial intelligence as it is right now. We might be looking back on this in a year and being like, oh wow, this is like primitive AI. But there's this idea of AI, artificial intelligence, as possibly providing, artificial intimacy. So there appears to be a growing trend of people, which is likely younger adults. And we saw that younger adults were 58%, I think, said they turned to social media to help cope with loneliness. But they're using AI to serve as their therapist, their confidant, some cases even as a romantic partner. So even this top story here, I listened to some interviews, and she was using AI as like her boyfriend. And I mean, she already had a boyfriend too, a real human one at the time, but forming like an emotional connection with AI. And what is this, what are the repercussions of this? We're still in the middle of it, so we don't fully know. I have some guesses, but I'm not going to make them on a recording. So, just some other trends to kind of be aware of as we think about what is the current landscape of loneliness. So, some more actionable steps we can take include social skills training. So understand that our brains, when we're lonely, we're in kind of fight or flight. We're more likely to interpret neutral reactions from other people as negative and over exaggerate people's responses as being like negative. Oh, they don't like me. Like they didn't scowl at you, they were just smirking. They thought what you said was funny, right? So sometimes we need to reframe, deepen our understanding of how loneliness impacts our brain. No, like it's not all in your head. I mean, it is in your head, it's in your brain, but it's like physically changing your brain. Like it's better to form these connections with yourself. Make action plans to be more social. Um, so actually the US Department of Health and Human Services, if you look up the loneliness advisory, they have a whole page. I was really pleasantly surprised earlier this year they added in some more ideas. So they have this recipes for connection resource that's developed kind of around this idea of a lot of people and a lot of different cultures meet around food, right? Food is an important thing for us. A lot of people share a meal. That's something that's meaningful. So they have all these different ideas out there for like how can we form more social connections while also eating and maybe even eating healthy, right? As extension educators or professionals. Um, and then advocating for policies that address that inequitable distribution of social capital. Social determinants of health in general play a big role here. And then this last one is what I'm going to spend the next, maybe 10 minutes talking about, but practicing mindfulness. So I want to go back to that idea of reconnecting with self. So a lot of these solutions that came out of the loneliness advisory and a lot of solutions people work on are focused on that social loneliness, or even that cultural loneliness as well as kind of part of it is in the public health landscape. As we look at policy systems and environmental changes or PSEs. Um, but I think that connection to the self slips through the cracks sometimes, and that can be a great place to start, right? Sometimes it's easier to, or more helpful maybe, to reconnect with yourself to understand kind of who am I? What are the things that I enjoy doing? What are the things I like? What are my strengths? What are the things I want to be doing? And then we can find others that are maybe also engaging in those spaces. And then we have something already built in that's in common, and we can organize around that. So this next section is going to be on making mindful connections. So how do we reconnect? And we can even think about it from those types of loneliness we talked about in the definitions across the lifespan. So I'm still relatively in younger adulthood. So and I might have some like I want to make some new connections. So how do I get out there and make new connections? Um, and maybe in the next few years I might want to be strengthening those connections I already have. Or in later adulthood, when I'm visiting my grandma, she's reminiscing on the old days and missing her friends. Like, how do I show up for her to have some more social support as maybe a caregiver? Um, so I'm going to talk about some definitions of mindfulness. I'm curious if many of you, if any of you, have heard of mindfulness, or what mindfulness even means to you specifically. And I'll talk more about what mindfulness is on the next slide too. So I'm going to be a little clinical for this slide. But mindfulness can be defined in many ways, the same way loneliness. These are kind of social constructs. But I'm going to start with a definition from Dr. John Kabat-Zinn. So he published this really seminal book in 1994 called Wherever You Go, There You Are. He's also the creator of mindfulness-based stress reduction. And he shared that mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And he expanded this definition to later include in the service of wisdom, self-understanding, and recognizing our interconnectedness with others and with the world, and thus also in the service of kindness and compassion. And I think that last part has been really speaking to me more recently. So I'll go over the first part again, though. So he basically said that if you are paying attention, and what are you paying attention to? Doesn't particularly matter. As long as you're intentionally paying attention on purpose, I like to say with purpose, in the present moment, not worrying about the past or the future, and you're doing so non-judgmentally, you're not judging yourself, you're kind of seeing things for what they are and going with the flow, then you are practicing mindfulness. Um, And then I like to keep that last part in mind too, to contextualize why I'm practicing mindfulness. I'm doing so in the service of wisdom, self-understanding, and recognizing our intrinsic interconnectedness with others and with the world. So in that service of kindness and compassion. Um, so some other ways to think about mindfulness that other researchers have expanded on is mindfulness is a process of self-observation, regulated attention, and developing this decentered perspective where we can understand the self and our thoughts as being separate from ourself, so we can observe them objectively and understand, hey, that's a thought my brain came up with. Do I want to accept that thought? Do I want to keep that thought with me? Is my, lonely brain maybe creating this thought, creating this scenario, and maybe it's not really um, capturing true objective reality. So maybe I want to reframe or let that thought go. Um, and then there's a big emphasis on practicing acceptance and patience and mindfulness as well. So accepting things for what they are, not trying to add our own spin on things, or accepting that we do have biases, and trying to set those to the side. So, with that being said, so kind of what is mindfulness? Mindfulness may take on many forms. There's no one singular way to practice mindfulness. I like to say there's no right way or wrong way. There's your way. So as long as you're paying attention on purpose in the present moment with a non-judgmental attitude, you're doing it. So mindfulness can be things like enjoying your morning cup of coffee, taking an intentional deep breath. So how many of you have maybe it's when you're stressed out, or maybe it's just you're trying to lock in and be focused, but you just take a deep breath. That's mindfulness. You can focus on an activity. So that might be like knitting or crocheting or washing the dishes. I always tell participants I do mindful brushing my teeth every morning and every night for at least 2 minutes, right? Um, being aware of your body and movements. So it could be activities like mindful walking, gardening, tai chi. Um, could be noticing your surroundings. So especially if the weather's nice around you, right? If you're able to go outside, or just noticing your environment right now. So one of the grounding practices we teach is the game of fives. So if you're having a hard time being centered in the present moment, you can say, what are 5 things I can, and then just use whatever senses you have available to you. Maybe it's 5 things I can see, smell, hear, touch, taste right now, or 4 new things, 3 new things. You have to focus on the present moment and your surroundings. And then that last one is being in the moment. So being in that present moment. Mindfulness isn't about the specific activity that you're doing. So it's not necessarily about, oh, I have to do this specific breathing practice or this specific guided imagery, but it's more about how we engage in the activity. It's a lot about process. It really is kind of about the journey rather than the destination. So I'm curious to know if any of you now, with this context in mind, engage in any mindfulness activities, or if there are any activities you do right now that you feel are mindful. Um, and it's okay if none come to mind as well. Um, and then I just want to share another research finding to help ground this with loneliness. So this is a study that was published in 2023. They found, I'll just read it word for word. A moderated mediation model result found that loneliness interferes with showing a healthy attitude toward oneself, linked to a low sense of meaning in life. And this effect was exacerbated for those who are less interpersonally mindful. So there's this kind of newish, at least new to me, and it's gaining more attention recently, field of interpersonal mindfulness. So thinking about how do we interact with others in a mindful manner. Um, so sometimes when I ask people in webinars or some of the programs we run around mindfulness, I ask them what mindfulness means to them, and they share being mindful of others. I'm like, oh, interesting, because I selfishly come to it from like noticing myself, but that's certainly an aspect of it. And someone shared Tai Chi and deep breaths for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I'm gonna spend another couple minutes going over some mindfulness resources that might get you started if you're interested, or just some other options out there to perhaps even expand your mindfulness practice or understanding of mindfulness. Um, so through Michigan State University Extension, and I have the web page on the bottom of the slide there, but we have a lot of one-time presentations that we offer right now to reach out and share different aspects of mindfulness or mindfulness as it pertains to different health topics. So we have topics that range from mindful eating to mindful walking, being kind to your mind and addressing, thoughts and emotions. Um, Even teaching childcare providers or teachers kind of how to set up maybe more mindful classrooms or encourage mindfulness with young children. So we have a lot of different types of presentations out there, and we also offer different series. So a series of programming. So we have our new Mindfulness for Better Sleep program that bundles 1 hour mindfulness training with our sleep. So even going back to that sleep salubrity from John Cacioppo, we know that mindfulness can help with sleep, and we know that sleep is also linked to the 10 major leading causes of death. So these topics really go really well together, right? We can apply mindfulness to basically any health topic because it's really about how we approach the human experience and condition. We also still offer Stress Less with Mindfulness from West Virginia Extension and Mindfulness for Wellbeing. These are a list of practices that we go through in our Mindfulness for Better Sleep series. And this is just a sample, like a sample platter at like, I don't know if I can say brand names like Costco or Sam's Club or a box store that you might go to that might hand out samples. We'll bleep it out in post. Um, but open monitoring, focused attention, guided imagery, mindful grounding, focused breathing, mindful movement, self-compassion affirmations, building a gratitude practice, even meditation. So there's a lot of different types of practices out there. So I really encourage you to try them. We encourage participants to just try the different practices, and we have the guided practices available, many of these available on our website. So if you go to our webpage, extension.msu.edu/mindfulness, you can find these practices. I actually have it up here. I can copy and paste it into the chat right now. Um, and It looks a little different because I gave you the fancy vanity URL. Um, but we just encourage you to try them because sometimes, one practice might not feel right on that day, or different practices work differently for different people in different scenarios as we go throughout life. And we know that obstacles come up all the time. And we really try to encourage people, and I encourage you all to try and build a practice. Try to build a sustainable practice. I'm working on this myself. Really looking at that last brick wall there. Practice, not perfection. Um, so explore the different types of practices out there. Share them with other people. You can do mindfulness with other people as well. So that's one way you can reconnect with yourself, reconnect with others, and it helps you reconnect with your environment as well. Try to do daily practice. So what is your routine right now where you could incorporate some mindfulness? So for me, it's mindful brushing my teeth. My first sip of coffee in the morning, I try to be very mindful about it and taste the flavors and the temperature and try not to burn my tongue. Um, Problem solve because life happens. Life's always happening, right? So when obstacles come up, how am I going to solve that problem? Understand that it's a lifelong learning, or take that perspective of, there's always more to learn. There's always things I can tweak or change or new things out there to explore. And then it's practice, not perfection, and practicing patience as well. So we're not trying to be perfect in these areas. We're just trying to practice. And then this is just my closing slide here that shows our website again. We also have a YouTube channel that's youtube.com/at mindfulness for better living that has some of these guided videos on there as well with animations. We have mindfulness timers. And I just posted a couple of mindful naturescapes as well. So I'm gonna close today by saying thank you all for joining. I think we have a few minutes for some more questions. I'm going to stop my screen share, um, and I'll answer this question real quick, if that's okay, Christy, that just came through. Um, so yeah, so loneliness in the agricultural community. I found this really interesting study a couple of years ago that was done in the UK where they surveyed ag workers, but they also surveyed ag support staff, which we have a lot of at Extension, at least here in Michigan, right, that are working with farmers. And they found these different types of loneliness. So those four contemporary types of loneliness with emotional loneliness, social loneliness, cultural loneliness, and spiritual loneliness. And they found that a lot of people were experiencing this sort of disconnection between, their livelihood, which a lot of them find great meaning in being good stewards of the land, and having a disconnection with the general public, where they might not understand, the use or the purpose of farming. They might not value or understand where their food comes from, right? Like when I go to the grocery store, I'm not even thinking, oh, this came from this farm or this farmer. I think there's even like Thank a Farmer today. I think it was like an initiative before. So there's different aspects that go into it. There's also this idea of stoicism in the farming community. And I can go for the next hour on this. But this idea of like, being able to express emotion, and there's a lot of time spent working alone out in the field for some farmers, depending on the type of farm. There's a lot of pressure to maintain farms that have been in the family for multiple generations. Um, so there's a lot of really interesting things happening. We have a managing farm stress program also at Michigan State University Extension where we provide some programming around managing stress. And I believe loneliness is part of it, not just for the farmer or the ag workers, but also for their family members as well. So hopefully that probably maybe gave you some more questions than answers, but I wanted to touch on that quickly.
Well, Tanner, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I did send or put into the chat box the link to our survey. So if you could quickly do that before you leave, that is so helpful for us as we plan the webinars coming up. Again, we don't have a webinar in July, but we will be back in August. And so also, if you are interested, you are an extension professional and you're interested in becoming or learning more about how to be a member of the North Central Region Aging Network, please add your name and your email address in the chat box and we will get back with you. We have 2 minutes before the top of the hour, so if anybody has any other questions for Tanner, but Tanner, thank you so much for your time and your expertise in this subject today, and we really appreciate it. It's because of people like you that we're able to offer these webinars on a monthly basis.
Yeah, thank you all. I appreciate it. I don't know if hopefully this link goes to the Mindfulness for Better Living YouTube channel. I gotta, you know, do the old grift of like and subscribe. That helps me out a lot too. Helps us reach more people. But I'm always excited anytime I get the opportunity to come and talk about loneliness outside of a therapy session. So it's always great, and thank you all for the feedback and questions you had as well. So I appreciate it.